Good evening, I'm Stephen Hobbs and this is the story of Jim and Mabel. I would like to tell you a love story, not Romeo and Juliet, not King Edward IV and Elizabeth Woodville, and certainly not Edward Longshanks and Queen Eleanor. No, I'd like to tell you the love story of Jim and Mabel, maybe a story you've not heard before because their story is not commemorated in statues or Shakespeare or schools. There isn't even a mural to them. But let me introduce you to them. Here's Jim. He's an apprentice engineer from Birmingham. Hello. Here's Mabel. She is a lady's maid in a fine house in London. Pleased, I'm sure. I could introduce them to each other. It would save an awful lot of fuss, but I can't do that. I have to leave that to fate. And fate does intervene, as she always does. And fate meets them up at the funeral of a very distant relative. A lady of great age, so her death was not mourned, but celebrated. And there were lots of people there, most of them much older than Jim and Mabel. In fact, Jim and Mabel were by far the youngest there. So it was not unusual for them both to find themselves sitting on the same pew in the church, or indeed next to each other in the tea queue afterwards, or even the fact that their elbows touched when they were eating cucumber sandwiches with the crusts cut off afterwards. And they got talking and they discovered that they had an awful lot in common. Firstly, they were both the owners, proud owners, of Claude Butler bicycles. Not many people had these. Now, Claude Butler was the Dyson of his time. Everybody had rallies, but if you wanted a Dyson, that marked you out. A Dyson was reliable, it had 3 gears as standard, but more especially, it was stylish. They had Claude Butlers and they talked about them, and they talked about the journeys they had made. 5 miles, 10 miles, 25 miles. They were proper cyclists, and the day passed very quickly, and they realised that soon they would have to go home. When would they meet again? And this was 1926, and times were hard and travel was expensive. It was Mabel who said we could meet at the next funeral. Jim had an idea. He reached into his pocket where he always carried his Ordnance Survey linen map. He laid it down on the table before them and said, look, I'm here and you're here, and look, there's a road that connects us, the A5. Mabel leaned forward. I've got an idea, she said. Why don't we meet in the middle? We could meet here. This will be our rendezvous. Jim leaned forward and he put his finger next to hers. And yes, he said, it is halfway, but it's a 2.5 mile. It's a 2.5 hour journey, lass. Could you manage this? I can if you can, lad, she said. This is what they did. And on their days off, they would arrange to meet. Jim would come down from Birmingham and Mabel would come up from London. They would meet at the rendezvous. Mabel would bring cheese sandwiches. Jim would bring apples or fruit, sometimes a fizzy Vimto, which they would share. Now, they cut a fine figure together, driving around on their Claude Butler bicycles. But owners of Claude Butlers never called them Claude Butlers, they called them CBs. So they were very fine. And people stopped and looked at them because they looked a handsome couple. And many a glance was directed in their direction, and not a few her fingers would wiggle at Mabel, because Mabel wore trousers. Very comfortable, she said, and very practical, when most women wore skirts. But Jim loved her the more for that. I have to tell you that at this time, the place of rendezvous was not like it is now. It was a very busy, bustling town, because all the traffic from London came up through the rendezvous, up to Birmingham. The lorries, the trucks, all the traffic. There was no bypasses. It was 30 years before the M1 was built. So all the traffic would come in. You had to have your wits about you if you were coming up the high street. In fact, there is a story that 2 men walking on this side of the street saw their friend Turnip Nicholson over there, and he waved them over. And they tried to cross the road and they were unable to do so. And after half an hour they gave up, and one mate turns to his friend and said, How did Turnip get the other side of the road? Ah, said his friend, he was born that side of the road. So it was a dangerous road to navigate, and one day Jim turned up at the rendezvous with his arm in a sling and his hand in plaster. I would love to be able to tell you that he had collided with a tram, and then I could tell you the story of the rendezvous, which had the most famous tram in the world here. It could carry 100 men from this town to the next town and back again, but that isn't the truth, so I can't tell you that story. No, it happened up in Birmingham, where Jim was a little absent-mindedly one day allowed the front wheel of his CB to catch in a tramway, which tipped him over onto his head. He had a big bump on his head, but he had broken his arm. But still, he had his arm repaired and he made the rendezvous. And for the next 2 months, even with his arm in a sling and heavy with plaster, he got to the rendezvous in time. This was their walking out. This was their courtship. And it proceeded for 5 years. Then Jim's apprenticeship finished, and he felt that now he was ready to take on his responsibility, and he proposed to Mabel. I'd like to think that he got off his bicycle to propose to her, but I'm not so sure about that. Of course she accepted, and they looked in Birmingham for a small house, but times were hard and they didn't really have the deposit. And it was then that Mabel's employer came up with a wonderful suggestion, because in the meantime Mabel had gone from being lady's maid to being head cook and housekeeper, a position of great responsibility. They didn't want her to leave, so they came up with a suggestion. Why don't you marry Jim? You and your young man can live in the gatehouse. I told you it was a fine house. And we've got a job for Jim. He can be our chauffeur, our mechanic and our head gardener. What do you think? Of course, they said, thank you very much. So they took it. And life was good, and they were able to save money, so when the children came, they had enough to buy a small house in Birmingham. The children came, and they didn't give up the bicycles. They still had bicycles. In fact, when Claude Butler brought out his first tandem, they were one of the first people to buy it, and they had it specially adapted. Jim would be on the front, Mabel would be on the back, and in between them they had a special child seat made, so that their daughter could sit there. They could still travel around. Then the war happened. Jim was in a reserved occupation. He was an engineer. During the day he did that. At night he was an air raid warden. They survived the war. Their children flourished. Their children left home. Their children met other partners. And one day her daughter brought home a young man who wanted the hand of their daughter in marriage. And he had great prospects. He had just got a wonderful new job. They were building a new town in a place called Milton Keynes. Of course, their daughter accepted. They moved to Milton Keynes and they bought a house in a place called Stony Stratford. And the first thing they did is they went up to Birmingham and they brought Mabel and Jim down to see their new house. Well, they sat in the garden, they drank tea, they ate cucumber sandwiches with the crusts cut off, and Jim got off to stretch his legs and he walked down to the bottom of the garden and looked over the hedge, and then he started shouting and waving his hands around. Mabel rushed over to see him, and soon both of them were shouting and waving their hands around, and had to explain to the young people that the bottom of the garden looked out onto the exact point of rendezvous where Jim and Mabel had met all those years ago. Rendezvous was in fact Stony Stratford. Now, as I say, there's no commemoration to these two, but I would like to say that they have a living legacy, because the story of Jim and Mabel is the story of ordinary people. It is the story of us. Thank you.